right, folks. Today we're looking at the census and why we don't know how many Arab Americans there are in the US or at the school. And if we were in school, our do now would be, do you want the US government to know a lot about you? Why or why not? The census is actually really important. Here's one example of the Arab American Association of New York, which, as you may remember, is a few blocks from our school, really reminding people to take the census, saying that the census means billions of dollars for New York City, including healthcare. And you can complete the census, my2020census.gov. Your family should have gotten a card or with your census number on it, and you can take the census on paper instead. And everyone can take the census. So it's in the Constitution, and it counts how many people there are in different areas. And it's for citizens, but it's also for people with green cards, different types of visas, people who are undocumented. Everyone takes the census. What are 3 reasons the census matters? So the census sounds boring. It's right. It's like just counting people. But the census data is used to allocate, meaning to give out $675 billion a year in funds for schools, hospitals, roads, public works, and other programs. New York City uses the census for planning and emergency preparedness. Businesses look at the census when choosing where to build their factories, homes, and commercial or business developments. And community boards and organizations use the census to figure out where there are large groups of people who might not be getting the services they need, figuring out what different communities need, advocating to try to get more services to communities. So as the Arab American Family Support Center said, the census is how we determine fair share. But you'll notice when you look at both the US Census and the data that New York City Department of Ed has on the High School of Telecommunication Arts and Technology, nowhere in here does it say anything about Arabs or Arab Americans or Middle Easterners. And so the census asks about race and ethnicity. So when it's asking about ethnicity, really it's asking, is your family Hispanic? So Hispanic or Latino, according to the census, refers to Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or any other Spanish culture or origins, regardless of race, right? So you can say no, not of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. Yes, Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, right? There's a bunch of different options. You can write one in. The other thing asks you about race: white, Black, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, other Asian, write it there. Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, Guamanian or Chamorro, Samoan, other Pacific Islander, some other race. And some people do choose to write Arab here. And you can pick as many boxes as that fit you. And the reason these are separate is because being Hispanic or Latinx is considered an ethnicity, and race is more about historical construct coming, and ethnicity is more like culture and where your family is from, and race is a little bit more about skin color. It's historically been used to separate people by skin color. And so there are Hispanic people who have very light skin and would say they're like a white Hispanic or white Latinx person. There are Hispanic people who are Black. So there's a variety of different races and ethnicities. So you'll notice that when you look at the 2010 census and the 2020 census is the same thing. I checked when I took my census a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, I guess now. White refers to a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. It includes people who indicated their races as white or reported entries such as Irish, German, Italian, Lebanese, Arab, Moroccan, or Caucasian. So if you write down Arab here, you're counted as white. So this is just what the census said in 2010, in case you're interested. And so there's been pressure and a growing campaign for Arab or MENA, which is Middle Eastern and North Africa, to be added to the census. Middle Eastern, in addition to Arabs, would also include anyone in the Middle East or North Africa who is not Arab. So, for example, Iranians would be considered Middle Eastern but not Arab. Turks would be considered Middle Eastern but not Arab. All right, so.
What do all of these Arab Americans have in common? The US government says they're white. Say what? As an Arab American myself, I wanted to look into why Arabs are considered white, why the census classification matters, and why changing it may be problematic. There are between 2 to 4 million Arabs in the US who hail from 22 different countries. But according to the box they're meant to check on the US Census and other applications, they're white. Now, let's first set aside the fact that the last time Mohammed Abdullah went through TSA security, he didn't necessarily reap any of that sweet white privilege. There's actually a history behind this categorization. It dates back to the 1880s and 1890s when Arabs first began immigrating to the US from present-day Lebanon and Syria. They settled in Boston, Detroit, and New York, establishing restaurants, businesses, and newspapers. But unlike Irish, Italian, and Portuguese immigrants, these newcomers didn't come from Europe. They came from Asia, at a time when white Americans felt that Asians would take their jobs. The Chinese Exclusion Act barred Asian immigrants from becoming citizens. In fact, up until 1952, generally only white people were eligible to become American citizens. And so Arabs went to court and fought several cases arguing they should be classified as white. And they won. Now, back then, being white came with a lot of perks, kind of like today. And so Arabs who sought white identification did so to avoid discrimination in public life and to be treated better than non-white minorities. But fast forward to today's post-9/11 America. Arabs are discriminated against regularly at airports and courts by the government and by the police. Many feel they're not treated as full American citizens, let alone white. So you might be asking, why does a box on the census even matter? Well, for one, having better data on the US population gives us a more complete picture of how diverse the country is becoming. And policymakers can potentially better serve the needs of their constituencies if they know more about them. The Arab American population has basically been invisible and hasn't gotten the benefits of having federal minority status. That's why during the 2010 census, activists encouraged folks to check it right, you ain't white. They argue that having actual data on the size of the community is helpful for political mobilization, tracking hate crimes, applying for federal grants for minority-owned businesses.
There are a certain number of small business grants and other grants from the federal government that you can only apply for if you are a federal minority. I'm noticing that I should pause this in a weird space for her. She has her eyes closed. Right, and the idea is to kind of try to make more equity if white people have traditionally been favored by the government, to try to make some more equality.
Being considered for affirmative action and health research. In 2013, Arab American organizations and academics sent the U.S. Census Bureau a letter to include a Middle Eastern or North African category for the next census in 2020, and the government is considering that today. But it's a double-edged sword, and not every Arab American is on board. Some warn that handing the government specific numbers and data will only result in more surveillance and profiling, and there's reason to be cautious. Data from the Census Bureau was used to round up Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. And in the years after 9/11, the Census Bureau shared survey information with the Department of Homeland Security on the Arab community, including details on Arabs and specific zip codes.
They had this information because, in addition to the every 10-year census required by the Constitution, they do smaller ones where they ask more detailed questions. And there had been one that had asked about being Arab or Middle Eastern, and they had used that data. The government had given that data to the FBI after 9/11 to sort of survey and check on specific Middle Eastern and especially Arab communities.
And that raised a lot of eyebrows among civil rights groups. So, in the future, Arabs may no longer have to check white, but will the positives of this development outweigh the potential dangers?